The Waterloo region is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land that was granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and is within the territory of the neutral, Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. In 1784, Sir Frederick Haldimand, Governor and Chief Representative for the British Crown, signed a decree that granted a large tract of land to the people of the Six Nations. This parcel of land, known as the Haldimand Tract, extended out for 10 kilometers on both sides of the Grand River from its source to its mouth on Lake Erie. It now encompasses large municipalities. An 1821 survey measured the tract to be 675,000 acres in size. Throughout the late 1700s and 1800s, the Crown and the Six Nations disputed the size and the rights to the title of this land. Problems began in 1795 when Joseph Brant, chief representative for the Six Nations, realized his people could no longer survive by hunting and fishing alone. So to assure an income, they would need to sell much of their Grand River lands. Blocks 2 and 3, which are the former township of Waterloo and today's Woolwich Township in the Waterloo region and amount to 180,000 acres, would be sold to land speculators Richard Beasley and William Wallace. But selling the land was not simple. Joseph Brant was told that the Six Nations people were not actual owners of the Grand River lands. The Crown still owned the land and only gave it for the Six Nations to occupy. This led to Joseph Brant fighting a legal battle to get the land sold. It took a year, but Brant was finally given a power of attorney to surrender the land, in trust, to the Crown. The Crown trustees would then sell the land, and in theory, forward the purchaser's payment to the Six Nations in the form of an annuity. In 1798, Crown patents for the land were finally issued to the purchasers. But the Six Nations' problems were far from over.
So the Six Nations people sold a major portion of their Grand River reserve in the hope of making an income. But what should have been a simple transaction never really materialized as it should have. My name is Dan Clark, and this is a story about the early settlement of the region of Waterloo and how my great-great-great-grandfather John Erb had a major part in its beginnings. We're on our way to the city of Kitchener, in the region of Waterloo, to see an historic landmark.
The city of Kitchener is within Block 2 of the Haldimand Tract, that Richard Beasley purchased in 1798. Beasley began selling this land in farm-size lots, along the Grand River, in the area that is now near the suburb of Doon. Back when there was just wilderness. The buyers were Mennonite land prospectors from Pennsylvania that were staying temporarily in the Niagara area, 110 kilometers away. These Pennsylvania Dutch Mennonites were looking for an area to start a new Anabaptist settlement in Upper Canada, and Niagara just didn't have the number of spring creeks and hardwood timber needed. The Mohawk of the Six Nations, however, directed them to much more suitable land that was available up the Grand River on Beasley's Block 2. From the year 1800 to 1802, Richard Beasley sold approximately 8,000 acres in the Doon area, to around 20 Mennonite families. It was here that the Betzners, Shirks, Beans and others began building their homesteads and the first white settlement in the entire inland region of Upper Canada. It was dubbed Little Paradise.
And this is the place. To commemorate these first settlers, the Doon Pioneer Memorial Tower was built here in 1926 on the original Betzner farm. But there was trouble in Paradise. This is the old foundation for the Betzner's barn, probably second generation. Behind me is the Pioneer Tower. It seemed that these early Mennonite settlers didn't have clear title to their land. They had paid Richard Beasley, but Beasley couldn't get a quit claim to the land from the Crown, who were representing the Six Nations. Instead, the money went towards interest that he owed on all of Block 2, and he still owed some interest. And so he's threatened with foreclosure. If Beasley couldn't make his payments, that would mean the Mennonite land titles were not valid. So money had to be raised somehow to pay Richard Beasley's debt, or the Mennonites were going to lose their land.
To keep what they called paradise, two of the Mennonite settlers began negotiating with Richard Beasley at his home in Burlington Heights, where Dundurn Castle now stands in Hamilton. The settlers' names were brothers Samuel and John Bricker. Both can be found in Mabel Dunham's 1924 novel, The Trail of the Conestoga. Though it's a work of historical fiction, where Samuel is the main character, much of the book is based on fact, such as John Bricker being married to John Erb's sister, Nancy Anna. Nancy Anna's cousin Daniel Erb had just arrived from Pennsylvania. He too, like the earlier settlers, was scouting for an area to start a new Mennonite settlement. Good farmland was getting too scarce and expensive in the Lancaster area of Pennsylvania as their Mennonite population grew, and the Grand River Valley in Upper Canada, though remote, had good potential. So Daniel Erb was intrigued by the negotiations that were going on between the Bricker brothers and Richard Beasley.
So here's the deal. Richard Beasley had the northern two-thirds of Block 2 virtually untouched. It was just what Daniel Erb was looking for. If Beasley could sell that for 10,000 English provincial pounds, he could pay off his debt to the Crown could pass the money on to the Six Nations, and the early settlers could keep their land. Everyone would be happy.
Daniel Erb was interested in Beasley's offer. But was there enough interested Mennonites back in Pennsylvania, willing to buy what amounted to about 60,000 acres? 10,000 pounds for that many acres was a bargain, even in those days, but still a lot of money for uncleared wilderness. So Daniel Erb and Samuel Bricker set out for Pennsylvania, to find out how many Mennonites were interested in becoming new Upper Canada settlers. In Lancaster County, Daniel met his cousins Jacob and John Erb, and told them of Beasley's offer. They thought it was a great opportunity, and what they had in mind would shape the Waterloo region into what it is today. John and Jacob Erb were brothers, born and raised in the Pennsylvania Dutch community of Warwick Township in Lancaster County. Today the area is one of the largest rural Mennonite communities in the world. John and Jacob's forefathers migrated here from Switzerland in the early 1700s to escape religious prosecution. The Erb family spread out on farms, mostly along Hammer Creek, east of Lidditz. Hammer Creek being part of the Conestoga River watershed. The area is well known for their Fraktura folk art. And while a variation of Palatinate German is the primary language spoken here, English is not far behind.
Word got around about Beasley's land offer in Upper Canada, and a community gathering was organized for those interested to meet across the road from what is today Snavely's flour mill.
The meeting was held at the home of Johannes Eby. Though no longer in the Eby family, the house still stands today, over 200 years later. The house and the original flour mill across the road on Hammer Creek date back to the 1790s. Both were built by Johannes Eby's father. Many members of the Eby family were in attendance, including Samuel Bricker, who was Johannes Eby's son-in-law. Daniel, John and Jacob Erb and much of the Erb family were also there, as well as their extended Mennonite family of Schneiders, Whistlers, Hershey's, Baumbergers and Webers.
They all knew their community needed more land to expand. But the choice of Upper Canada was in question. Why not out west? Why so much land? Was it surveyed? How big were the lots? Can Beasley be trusted? Is it viable? This is where John Erb stepped in.
There is no transcript of what John Erb actually said, but he was eager to make the Beasley deal happen. He knew from the early scouts back from the Grand River Valley that the land there was similar in quality to the Hammer Creek area. He knew from Samuel Bricker and Daniel Erb that it was an all-or-nothing deal, and all 60,000 acres would need to be bought. He knew the land was being surveyed into about 440-acre lots, making a total number of lots around 130. Selling off 130 lots to incoming settlers would take time, but he was sure the interest was there. And to be sure, the idea of a British-run government in Upper Canada would have been a hot topic. The American Revolutionary War, only 20 years prior, was a difficult time for the Mennonite Brethren and their pacifist beliefs. The new Republic of the United States had viewed fighting as their duty. But the British recognized the tenets of the Mennonite faith, and the Mennonites could live knowing they would not be pressed into military service.
Of course there was risk, but my great-great-great-grandfather John Erb was willing to take that risk. He wouldn't be able to make all the payments himself, so he needed the community behind him. Unfortunately, not everybody was on board. That is until Johann Ebbe stood up and put the fear of God into everyone. At least that's how the story goes. Truthfully, though, the Mennonite and Christian way to help those in need may have nudged enough of the community to clinch the deal. The early Mennonite settlers in Upper Canada who first bought from Beasley but didn't get clear title were definitely in need. Without the deal, they would lose their land and their livelihood. So Samuel Bricker and Daniel Erb headed back to Upper Canada.
On November 28, 1803, in Niagara, and on behalf of the Pennsylvania Mennonites, Daniel Erb and Samuel Bricker signed an article of agreement to purchase Richard Beasley's 60,000 acres for £10,000. The closing date was June 1, 1804, which gave the Mennonites only 6 months to raise the necessary funds. They formed a syndicate of 26 individuals, calling themselves the German Company. Acting as stockholders, each contributed what they could afford, and received a corresponding amount of land. Lots were drawn for which lands they would receive. John Erb and Jacob Whistler were the largest stockholders. Between them they received over 15,000 acres. The Erb family would hold the most number of lots. Combined, they received over 40% of the entire 60,000 acres. Daniel, Jacob, and John Erb in turn became agents for the newly formed German company.
But it soon became obvious that the £10,000 target amount was not going to be reached by the June 1st closing date. They would only be halfway there, and an extension in time would be needed. But they did have half the amount of money. They just had to deliver it, and change the closing date, giving them enough time to raise the other half. So in the spring of 1804, Daniel, Jacob, and John Erb, as well as Samuel Bricker, loaded the money in the form of American silver dollars into leather saddlebags and mounted on pack horses headed north to Upper Canada.
After picking up Richard Beasley at Burlington Heights, they headed directly to the town of York, which is present-day Toronto, to the Parliament of Upper Canada. The money was received by the government's Executive Council, who were both Richard Beasley's creditor, and the Six Nations trustees. Unfortunately, after the exchange rate, the amount only came to £4,602. It was slightly less than the expected £5,000, however it was considered close enough by the council and it kept the deal in play. Everyone was also in agreement to push the closing date back a year, and the remaining balance plus 6% interest would be due on the 23rd of May 1805. The German company was now given the needed extra time, and the balance was to be paid directly to the head of Indian Affairs, William Claus. His job was to make sure the Six Nations would receive the annuity from the investment of the sale of their land, as promised. A job he would fail miserably at.
But the German company was doing their best to hold up their end of the deal. Even John Erb was doing his due diligence and scouting the area later in October to see what supply lines and milling facilities were available in the Grand River Valley. What happened next is a bit of a mystery. Possibly John Erb was somewhere where he shouldn't have been, and somehow came in contact with a very angry indigenous tribesman with a musket.
Letter dated October 29, 1804, from the Governor's Secretary to William Claus. The Attorney General has stated to the Lieutenant Governor that on the 22nd of this month, about a quarter of a mile east side of Moss's Mill in the county of Haldimand, one John Erb, late of the county of Lancaster in the state of Pennsylvania, a purchaser of part of the land sold by Mr. Beasley, was with a malicious intention, shot at and wounded by a Mississauga Indian, known by the name of Jack. The wound will most probably not prove mortal, but Mr. Erb's arm is much shattered, and he has received hurt on other parts of the body. The Indian fired with ball.
The letter goes on to say that the tribesman was arrested, but then later escaped. And of course John Erb recovered. But it's interesting to think, what if he didn't? What if that musket ball was over a couple inches and John didn't survive? His youngest son, and my great-great-grandfather Christian Erb, was not yet conceived. That means that whole branch of the family would never have existed, including a lot of this. And me.
Many of the German company stockholders would need to liquidate most, if not all, their Pennsylvania properties to pay their share of the balance owed to Beasley, and in turn to the government of Upper Canada. John Erb was no different. He had over 200 acres of farmland in Lancaster County, containing a 36 by 20-foot two-story house, a stable and a wash house.
And I was lucky enough to see in person a deed where he sold a parcel of that land. It was here at the Mennonite Life Archives in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The archivist who found the document had emailed me a photo of it, but now I was going to see the real thing.
I'm so surprised to find this.
And I'm pretty excited to see it, actually. The deed we're about to see is for a piece of land in Warwick Township, first acquired by John Erb's father, Christian Erb Sr., and then passed on to John. They named it Bunker Hill, most likely on a whim. Christian Erb Sr. gave other properties odd names like Barcelona and Quebec. The land is situated outside the village of Brunerville. John sold it to Christian Reiser. The date on the document is March 18, 1805. And as you will see, the hand-done calligraphy is outstanding, done with brush and quill on vellum.
Just have to dig out the right one. Does this look like it?
That looks like it. Oh, what I really want to see is the wax seals. This is amazing.
I know, these are still...
I know, they're still intact. Oh, wow. See, I've seen photocopies of his signature, and that's it.
Oh, okay.
But
like on other documents.
On other documents, but not the real thing.
Yeah, it's pretty.
It is amazing.
I didn't think I would find this, and then I just looked again on those cards, and I thought, oh, what's this? And I couldn't believe it.
There was no record of this deed found on the Lancaster County Recorder of Deeds website, even though it states on the deed that it was registered in April of 1805. So finding the original was a pleasant surprise.
Usually wax seals have a characteristic design that confirms one's identity, but the image on John's wax seal is difficult to see. It's also slightly damaged. It is, after all, over 200 years old. I was, however, able to outline some of the major contours. It could be the image of a ship, or maybe a ladle, or maybe the inner workings of a grist mill. I can't be sure.
John Erb likely did have some milling experience. An 1800 Pennsylvania septennial census listed him as a farmer. But his first cousin, also named John Erb, was working close by as a miller at the Stauffer's grist mill on Hammer Creek. The Stauffer grist mill still stands, but converted into a home. The Stauffers were also close friends of the Erbs, and Abraham Stauffer, who was with John when he was shot in Upper Canada, was also John's neighbor. So it wouldn't be a surprise if John was well connected to the milling business.
By April of 1805, the German company had collected the remaining balance of what they owed for Beasley's 60,000 acres. The story how that money actually made it from Pennsylvania to Upper Canada has been passed down through the generations from John Erb's sister, Nancy Anna, to her great-grandson, Irwin Bricker. Irwin Bricker's story and how the second half and the balance of the money was delivered to Upper Canada in 1805 can be found in the Waterloo Historical Society's 1934 annual report.
For the second journey, the money was first packed into a wooden keg, which in turn was securely fastened to a light wagon, affectionately called in Swiss German, a Leistplacier-Mickli. The wheels from that wagon can be found in the Ken Sealing Museum in Kitchener. The wagon's driver was Samuel Bricker, while John Bricker and Daniel, Jacob and John Erb would join the convoy on horseback. They were all well armed with heavy muzzle loaders against any possible marauders. They usually managed to spend their nights in taverns, or in some lonely settler's shack, and as was their custom, the keg was placed in the center of the room while 4 of them slept forming a square about their treasure. The 5th member of the party acted as a guard, sitting on the keg with a gun on his knee. Fortunate indeed for all concerned, that such a provision was made for the protection of the money. For one night a couple of desperadoes endeavored to secure the prize by breaking down the door of their room. A scuffle ensues. The reception the bandits received, however, was more than they could handle, so they fled and were seen no more. With the money still safely in tow, the convoy continued their journey, arriving in Niagara to meet their solicitor, William Dixon. William Dixon's legal services would ensure a true clear title of Beasley's land, and would avoid the same problems the earlier Mennonite settlers had with Beasley a few years before.
Money from the Beasley sale did go in part towards an annuity for the Six Nations, but after William Claus took £2,000 out of the fund, claiming it as his expenses as a trustee, there wasn't a lot left.
William Claus also lacked any accurate accounting on where the payout of this annuity went, which in part has formed the basis for the Six Nations land claims against the Canadian government. Land disputes that have dragged on now into the 21st century.
But the Beasley sale went well for the German company. Agents Daniel and Jacob Erb finalized the purchase of Beasley's 60,000 acres on June 29, 1805, at Richard Beasley's home at Burlington Heights. In the meantime, John Erb was in York finalizing a land purchase of his own. Just the day before, on June 28th, he bought 229 acres from Richard Beasley's brother-in-law, Benjamin Springer. The land is situated on the Speed River, just upstream from where it flows into the Grand, in present-day Preston, Cambridge.
The modern city of Cambridge has since built itself up around this particular property, but back in 1805 there was nothing here but trees. Mostly old-growth hardwoods. And though the location was outside the 60,000 acres bought from Richard Beasley, it was ideal for the first infrastructure a new community in those days would need. A water-powered sawmill. The lay of the land was perfect. And the Speed River was powerful enough to drive any type of commercial mill. And yet there was also a shallow ford, where horses and wagons could cross the water without the need of a bridge.
They did eventually build a bridge. But before any of this could happen, the German company and their families would need to get here from Pennsylvania, which included John Erb's family.
John Erb's wife Magdalena, and 7 children between the ages of 15 and 2 would be in the first wave of migrants, traveling 3 weeks from Pennsylvania to the Grand River Valley by Conestoga wagons.
The Conestoga wagon originated in Lancaster County and was used mostly for moving freight. The larger wagons could carry over 5,000 kilograms and needed 6 or more horses or oxen to pull them. They were well adapted for moving the German company families from Pennsylvania to Upper Canada.
The journey was over 750 kilometers in total, with 600 kilometers of it on fairly well-beaten trails to the border of Upper Canada.
This is the plaque for the Conestoga wagon track. This is where they crossed Niagara River. On the American side was Black Rock. On this side it was called Fort Erie Mills. It's about 4 kilometers downstream from Fort Erie. And it wasn't the worst trip in the world back then. There was a ferry system. It took about 15 minutes, 20 minutes to get across. 2 sweeps, 1 oarsman. Cost about 20 shillings to get across. Capacity was about 5 horses. But you know, it wasn't the worst part of this trip. Niagara, they have lots of stories about being the worst, but I'm going to tell you where the worst was. That's where we're going next. This is the hardest obstacle that the early pioneers had to cross. The Beverly Swamp. It's only 5,000 acres today. Back then it was about 10 times that size. They went through bog up to their knees, and it was almost impossible to go around.
Nothing but a broken trail existed through the Beverly Swamp area that stretched from north of Dundas to well into today's Waterloo region. After the Mennonite migration began in 1805, a corduroy road, built of logs, began to be constructed on parts of the trail. In 2016, this log road was rediscovered during construction on King Street in Kitchener. It really wasn't until after the War of 1812 that a decent road from Dundas to the Waterloo area was built wide enough to handle regular wagon traffic.
Some of the arriving German company families tried to avoid the Beverly Swamp and took a more roundabout way up the east side of the Grand River through the present-day Glen Morris Valley wetlands area. However, that route in 1805 wasn't that much better and a lot longer, especially if you had business in Dundas or the Burlington Heights area.
And on July 20th, Daniel and Jacob Erb did have business in Burlington Heights as they drew up the land deeds for each of the German company stockholders.
As one of the shareholders, John Erb received 3 deeds for 7,510 acres in total. It cost him £1,250. Witnesses on the deeds were Richard Beasley and Benjamin Springer.
While Daniel and Jacob Erb's roles as agents for the German company were more administrative, with the signing of deeds, John Erb's were more logistical. John would build some basic necessary infrastructure to open up the land for the incoming settlers. Trees needed to be cleared, and homes and structures built. So his plans for a sawmill began. A short mill race was dug across a small island in the Speed River, situated on John's property. The water drop was just enough to power a primitive sawmill. But with limited available supply lines, finding the hardware and the saw blades to build such a mill was difficult. The closest sawmills were in York and Niagara, and they were getting their parts from the state of New York. It took nearly a year, but in the spring of 1806, John had his sawmill up and running, cutting enough boards to supply the needs of the new settlers. There were of course some more setbacks. While burning brush in the Blair area along the Grand River, the fire got out of control, and ended up burning some newly built cabins and barns, and large areas of forest.
But there was also some progress. In 1806, John Erb bought 311 more acres next to the Speed River, with the hope of building a gristmill over the next year. His father and mother and my great-great-great-great-grandparents, Christian Erb Sr. and Maria, arrived from Pennsylvania and bought 183 acres to the west. Christian Sr. and Maria, however, were up in age and never lived here. Instead, they lived out the rest of their lives with their daughter Elizabeth and her husband Christian Snyder in nearby Doon. Christian Snyder is the brother of Joseph Snyder. Joseph built the Snyder House in Kitchener, which is now a National Historic Site and museum.
The success of the German company's purchase of the Beasley property had promoted further interest in the abundant cheap land along the Grand River, both among the Mennonite community and local land speculators. Of particular interest was a large area of Block Number 3, now known as Woolwich Township, north of Block 2. The Crown, acting as trustees for the people of the Six Nations, had issued a land patent for Block 3 to tavern owner William Wallace from Niagara. But like Richard Beasley, William Wallace hadn't made any payments for his Grand River property. So the land was going to be forfeited back to the Crown. But the Mennonite community had a better idea.
They would buy it. Well, not all of it, but a large part of it. Over 45,000 acres. The brother of Johann Eby, Benjamin Eby, who would become the first Mennonite bishop in the Waterloo region, initiated the idea. While exploring the area of Block 3, Benjamin thought this was also an excellent property for the Mennonite community to expand into. So he took that idea back to both Pennsylvania and the local community along the Grand River. There was lots of interest, and the German company was reassembled with some of the original players, as well as many new ones, over 40 individuals in all. The land surveyor for the area, Augustus Jones, would also get involved.
This fountain, in the Stony Creek Town Square, was built to honor surveyor Augustus Jones. He was the original surveyor for much of Upper Canada, including Hamilton and York Townships, the Six Nations lands, Dundas Street and Yonge Street. He was also a good friend of Joseph Brant. So to help Joseph Brant and the Six Nations, Augustus saw the sale of a portion of William Wallace's Block 3 to the Second German Company as a priority. If the sale was successful, Wallace would have the necessary funds to pay what he owes to the trustees of the Six Nations. So Augustus Jones teamed up with Jacob and John Erb as agents of the new German company.
In 1807, Augustus Jones surveyed the area of Block 3. This is a copy of that actual survey. The land available for the German company to purchase amounted to 45,195 acres. Jones cut that parcel up into 130 lots of approximately 350 acres. The lots were distributed amongst the stockholders of the newly formed German company. Stockholders were from both inside and outside the Mennonite community.
The manuscript, A Biographical History of Waterloo Township, by Benjamin Eby's grandson Ezra Eby, states that the money from the Pennsylvania stockholders to purchase the Woolwich land arrived in Upper Canada in June of 1807 with the families of Joseph Schneider, Benjamin Eby, Abraham Weber, and Peter and Daniel Erb. This is Abraham Weber's Conestoga wagon that was used for that 1807 trip, now restored and on display at the Ken Sealing Museum in Kitchener.
The money for William Wallace's land was soon collected from all of the reassembled German company stockholders. And on July 24, 1807, in Niagara, a land memorial was wrote up stating the sale of Wallace's 45,195 acres of Block 3 to the German company agents of Augustus Jones and brothers Jacob and John Erb. Those three agents in turn signed over the land of 130 lots to all the individual stockholders. But none of these signed land memorials mention the money, and paperwork is limited on where all the money went.
It's been estimated that the German company paid roughly £5,600 for William Wallace's property. Researchers for the Six Nations believe the money did make it into the hands of the Upper Canada government, where it was supposed to all go into a trust fund for the Six Nations. But again, the lack of accounting of this money has led to ongoing litigation between the Six Nations of the Grand River and the Canadian government. But, back in 1807, the sale of William Wallace's land to the German company stockholders appears to have gone off well without a hitch. And though a few stockholders settled right away on their land, most simply resold or passed the property down to their children. John Erb, being both an agent and stockholder of the German company, received 10 lots of his own, amounting to 3,500 acres. One of those lots, Lot 7, is now the entire east side of the town of St. Jacobs. St. Jacobs is well known for its year-round farmers market, the largest in Canada. Another of John's lots is Lot 90. Lot 90 is now the north end of the town of Elmira. Next to him is Lot 89, which is now the center of town and originally owned by fellow stockholder James Gage. James Gage was not a Mennonite, but a speculator from Stony Creek. His mother was Augustus Jones's sister. James is known for living in the historic Gage House during the War of 1812, and the site of the Battle of Stony Creek. Another property of John Erb's was Lot 71, which today is the village of West Montrose. It's the home of the Kissing Bridge, the last remaining public wooden covered bridge in Ontario.
This is it, the Kissing Bridge.
1807 was a busy year for John Erb. Not only was he busy as a German company agent, he also bought 404 more acres that year for himself next to his Speed River property. At this point, he now owned over 12,000 acres overall. He also finished another raceway next to his sawmill to power a new grist and flour mill, the first commercial grist mill in all of the Waterloo region. The next closest commercial grist mill was in Ancaster, over 60 kilometers away on the other side of the Beverly Swamp. In those days, the grist mill was considered the center of many rural communities, and the building of John Erb's grist mill did pull together the region's widespread group of Mennonite settlers, but the population back then was only 250. It was humble beginnings, but that would change.
This is where John Erb built his first mill. It's now called the P&H Milling Company.
John Erb would name his first little grist and sawmill, Cambridge Mills. It's where today's city of Cambridge got its name. John likely picked out the name with help from his father. His father, Christian Erb Sr., had called properties back in Pennsylvania names like Barcelona and Bunker Hill. So coming up with the name Cambridge was probably more on a whim than the name having some significance. The building of a wooden gristmill in the middle of nowhere wouldn't have been easy in those days. Most likely it involved the help of much of the community and the expertise of other millers. The millstones would have come from local quarries, rather than imported from distant places like Cocalico, Pennsylvania or France, where the very best stones come from. And like the sawmill, many of the parts for the gristmill would have come from the state of New York. John would operate the grist and sawmills for the rest of his life, passing them down to his son Joseph. And though he owned a substantial amount of land, he did very little farming. Instead, he leased or sold the land to what at first was a slow influx of new settlers. And the immediate land around his mills were kept pristine and in his control, free from any imposing neighbors that could disrupt the water easement rights he had on the Speed River. Another venture of John Erb's was to solve the problem of illegal Mennonite marriages. Mennonite bishops could not perform legal marriages in Upper Canada, at least not until 1831 when the laws were changed. So in 1809, John Erb was sworn in as a justice of the peace, to perform marriages for the Mennonite, Tunker and Amish communities in the area. He would hold this magistrate position for over 10 years, attending the district's Court of General Quarter Sessions. However, his duties would prove difficult during the War of 1812, as Mennonites were pacifists. And though Mennonites were excused from fighting in battle, they could still be required to participate in the war effort in other ways, such as transporting military supplies using their own horses and wagons. Such participation raised much conscientious objection among the Mennonite community. And John Erb had to deal with that, balancing his judicial duties with his religious convictions.
John Erb was also an executor in his father's will. His father and my fourth great-grandfather, Christian Erb Sr., passed away before the war in the summer of 1810. He was 75. Christian's wife and my fourth great-grandmother, Maria, passed away 4 years later. She was 76. They're buried here in the Old Blair Cemetery in Cambridge. They had 12 children. Their gravestone is a replacement. The weathered original is displayed in the library of the Conrad Grebel University College in Waterloo. But the circle of life continues. Just 11 days after Christian Erb Sr. died, John Erb and his wife Magdalena had a baby daughter. 4 years later, they had their 9th child, my great-great-grandfather, Christian Erb Jr.
In keeping with his commitment to the Mennonite community, John Erb would build a local meeting house for Mennonite minister Joseph Bechtel. Services so far had been held only in neighbors' homes or in Bishop Benjamin Ebby's log meeting house, 10 kilometers further up the Grand River. Something closer to the Cambridge Mills area was needed. So in 1814, John built a brick structure just 2 kilometers north of his mills, for the local Mennonite minister Joseph Bechtel, and for all other religious denominations to use. It was the first brick church in the Waterloo region. It was also around this time, John Erb set up a general store, close to his mills, for merchant John Lesser and his wife. It was the first store in the region. And a couple of years later, in 1816, he helped his brother Abraham build another grist mill, 15 kilometers to the north on Laurel Creek. Abraham Erb is considered the founder of Waterloo, and the one who came up with its name. John Erb would continue to help others build. Over the next 2 years, a few new businesses would pop up around his Cambridge mills. A woodturner, a tannery, an oxen smith, a brewery, and even a nearby tavern. 1818 was also the year John Erb expanded the capacity of his grist mill, with the help of Ira White, a millwright from Rochester, New York. John also bought out the nearby general store in 1820, for his son Joseph to run. There's evidence that John originally built 2 homes for his family. Both are long gone, but this house across the road from today's flour mill may be sitting on one of the old foundations. Next door to it is another house built by John's son Joseph in the 1850s. There's also this curious old photo that's been handed down through the family. It's believed to be one of John's buildings taken around 1890 on the Speed River Flats. What it was for, or where exactly it was, remains a mystery.
Sadly, on June 2, 1826, John's wife and my third great-grandmother, Magdalena, passed away at the fairly young age of 56. She was a prolific mother, leaving behind a legacy of 9 children that have produced hundreds of descendants. To have lived a hard pioneer life, she must have been a very hard-working, strong character, with lots of patience and a love for family. A large family. She is buried in the Mennonite Hagee Cemetery in Cambridge.
Over the next 6 years, the influx of settlers increased, and John Erb was able to dispose of all his property. The 7,500 and 3,500 acres he acquired through the German company, and the 1,000 or so acres on the Speed River. He would dispose of it all, passing some of it down to his adult children. The land around Cambridge Mills went to his sons Joseph and John Jr., who added a distillery and helped Jacob Thoman build the area's first hotel. Joseph and John Jr. had a development plan to eventually lay out a village around their father's mills, calling it Preston, after their surveyor's hometown in England. Preston would eventually grow to a population of 17,000, before amalgamating with the nearby towns of Galt, Hespeler and Blair in 1973, to form the city of Cambridge. On the corner of King Street East and Waterloo Street North is an Ontario historical plaque. The founder of Preston, John Erb Sr. Born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and a Mennonite of Swiss ancestry, John came to Upper Canada in 1805, acquired 7,500 acres of land from the German Land Company, and settled on the site of Preston. The following year he built a sawmill and in 1807 a gristmill, around which the community grew. The numerous descendants of John Erb and his relatives have played an important role in the development of Waterloo County. John Erb Sr. had distributed most of his estate to his children before his death, and died without a will, leaving behind only about £500 worth of personal items and assets. John's eldest son Samuel was appointed administrator by the surrogate court, and the remainder of John Erb's estate was distributed amongst the family.
This is the final resting spot for John Erb. His wife Magdalena is beside him. He died in 1832 at the age of 67. He had 9 children. I'm not a Mennonite, but I respect their core values. I respect that he has a very strong sense of community. He depended on the community in the pioneer life, and they certainly depended on him. I'm very proud to be a descendant of this man.